A warm welcome to the audience and to our distinguished guest, Professor Fatima El-Tayeb. Welcome. Fatima, it's so nice to have you with us today. And we are very happy that so many of you have joined us for this event. And the series is hosted by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies in collaboration with the Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies. And it is convened by my colleague Eline Westra, who you see here in the picture, and myself, Sonja Evaldsson, Mellström. And Eline and I will be moderating tonight's session together. So our guest tonight is Professor Fatima El-Tayeb, who is Professor of Literature and Ethnic Studies and Associate Director of Critical Gender Studies at the University of California, San Diego. In her research, Professor El-Tayeb centers the racialization of migrants, refugees, Muslim, Black, and queer Europeans of color, focusing particularly on arts and activism as the sources of resistance and political action. So welcome to the series, Professor El-Tayeb. We're very excited to have you with us here today. So throughout the series, we have invited scholars, such as yourself, who in different ways have worked at the intersections between race and migration studies in Europe. And when planning these series, we've had two overarching questions in mind that we would like to discuss with you to begin with. So I'm going to hand over to Eline now to pose those two questions and to continue the conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sonja, and welcome again, Fatima. Yeah, let us indeed kick off the conversation with these central questions with which we have set up the lecture series. So what are these points of contestation between race and migration studies in 21st century Europe? And why have these fields developed parallel to each other and not always in conversation with each other?
Well, first off, thanks so much for inviting me. Especially thanks to Eline and Sonja for organizing this whole series, which sounds amazing. And I'm honored to be the one kicking it off. To your question, I, of course, can only answer from my own perspective. It's not as if I have definitive answers to the genesis of migration and critical race studies in Europe. But I think one obvious point is simply the fact that there is traditionally and still a lot of resistance against the idea that race is something that is internal to Europe and therefore something that should be studied in Europe by scholars that are focusing on European societies, where it is a little bit different with migration, in part obviously because migration can keep up this notion of race as external to Europe, right? Migration is about the external, whereas race isn't necessarily, or from my perspective, of course, the important point is that race is internal to Europe more so than to any other place in the world, because the notion of race was created in Europe to the advantage of Europe. So in many ways, the whole idea of Europe is inseparable from notions of race, but that's not exactly a commonplace perspective, in part because Europe and its entanglement with race also means that there's a naturalization of the idea that Europe is white. At the same time, that also means that race in Europe is primarily understood to be about racialized people. So the narrative around race is basically Europe is the raceless continent, and recently race was introduced because racialized populations arrived from outside, which then again ties race to migration studies. But so in some ways, because race is not considered internal to Europe, there are really no institutional spaces for critical race studies. As far as I know, the only thing that existed or still exists is an undergrad program for Black Studies in the UK, but the UK officially is not part of Europe anymore. So basically there is nothing. So then migration studies had to, in some way, stand for institutional discussions of race, but the focus of migration studies and critical race studies is not naturally the same. They are not really one and the same discipline, so there were lots of understandable tensions where I see a challenge with migration studies is where it doesn't diverge from this notion of race as not being internal to Europe, and instead uncritically shares this dominant idea that race is something that exists primarily in the US and in South Africa. So in other words, again, racism is where people of color are, rather than racism is where racists are, which, you know, applies to Europe. And then also this equation of race and racism with Black people and anti-Black racism, which in some ways naturalizes notions of race, right? There's racism against Black people because Black people are obviously visibly different from us. And this is an approach that ignores the important first step, namely the construction of this us as white and European, that can't really be grasped with the focus of migration studies, but which needs critical race theory. So what really should exist, I think, would be those two disciplines in conversation with each other, but with the understanding that they can't be folded into each other. And I think that is also made particularly difficult because migration studies or much of the most interesting part of migration studies has a foundation in a kind of continental European Marxism that importantly points to the fact that this so-called cultural racism that is admitted to existing in Europe and that is often separated from a supposedly older colonial racism, which I think is a very problematic division, that this cultural racism has its roots in an economic question. So there's a connection made to class, but at the same time, there is often this insistence that class is a universal category and race isn't. Race is particular to specific contexts, and the European context is not one of them, in which race would be relevant, and that leads to tensions not only within disciplines, but also among activists. In Germany, for example, there's a lot of tension around the question of critical whiteness studies, where you have activists that, you know, did work together and should work together are divided along, I would say, their understanding of race, because there's of course the fact that you have populations in Europe that face structural discrimination because they are descendants of labor migrants. So you have populations such as people of Italian or Eastern European descent in Germany who face something that they define as racism, and which is structural discrimination, but they also are categorized as white, which they understand as a proof of the fact that this kind of color-based racism doesn't exist in Europe, and who often argue that a focus on terms like people of color, BIPOC, is divisive rather than helpful. Whereas on the other side, of course, you have activists who do not have that ability to pass for white, and who in turn see that refusal to recognize that racial privilege exists in Europe, including among marginalized groups, as the real problem. And there often is a limited ability to find common ground. And you mentioned earlier that Alyosha Tudor will be somebody who will speak, and of course they try to capture that with this notion of migrantization as something that captures the discrimination of people who at the same time have white privilege. So there are attempts to find this common ground. But part of the reason that they face so many challenges is that there is so little institutional support for either discipline, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's already a very interesting and extensive answer to these very big questions. And I wondered how, in your work, of course, the queer of color critique lens is very central, and I wonder how that fits into what we just discussed. So what does it mean to study race and migration in Europe through that lens?
Yeah, well, if my answers are too extensive, aka too long, you can just interrupt me.
Oh no, certainly not too long, just admirably.
Well, queer of color critique for me is a very useful lens, because it combines what I see as the strengths of the different approaches that are often in conflict in Europe. So it has a very materialist grounding. At the same time, it's very intersectional and explicitly builds on women of color feminism. And it is one of those theoretical approaches that reject this notion of a universal theory that can explain everything, be it Marxism or something else. So in that sense, there's also, I think, an affinity to decolonial theory, and this idea that there's an overarching shared interest, but how that is applied depends on the particulars of the situation. And that includes the particulars of the positionality that we are in as scholars or as activists. So it asks for a certain kind of flexibility that demands that you constantly question what are the circumstances, what is my position in it, which is somewhat exhausting, but it's also very generative, I think. And it is eclectic in the sense that it then uses approaches such as US grounded critical race theory, which of course in some ways has a tendency to universalize the US conditions, but that doesn't mean that it can't be applied to other contexts, such as Europe, in part because, again, the idea that Europe is somehow untouched by a notion of race that is present everywhere else is just obviously wrong. And the recognition that there's something like a global structure of racial capitalism doesn't mean that it plays out everywhere in the same way. It just means it's not absent anywhere. And a queer of color critique in some ways uses the positionality of multiple marginalizations to theorize. So the goal is not necessarily to shift the center somewhere else, but to get rid of the notion of a center. And that's just something that just spoke to my approach, and I find it very useful, and I also think it's something that could help us deal with things that are in some ways maybe particularly European, such as the positionality of Roma and Sinti, for example, which is a diasporic population that is present across the world, but I think has a particular history in Europe, particularly explicitly racialized history, but at the same time, this is something that kind of falls out of all kinds of theorizations of race. And I think queer of color critique or decolonial approach would be a perspective that would allow us to look, for example, as Roma and Sinti communities as an example of a specific European racialization that cannot be equated with the situation in, for example, the US, but can be understood using some of those tools that were developed there, because we have to work against this refusal of many European scholars to create tools in Europe, right? Because of this resistance against the notion of race as being something that white Europeans should feel very inclined to try to understand, because, you know, they know most about it really, and they profit most from it.
Yeah, thank you. And you raised, you briefly mentioned the word diaspora. And this notion you described in your book, European Others, as an alternative framework of identification for racialized Europeans. And I would like to hear something more, if I may ask, about your definition of diaspora, and maybe also how this may be different from more traditional definitions of diaspora in migration studies.
Yeah, I think the notion of diaspora, of course, has its origin with a focus on the Jewish diaspora. So that would be a diasporic population with a particular origin, but not a particular national national home. And the way that diaspora often is used in diaspora studies is this idea, this is an exchange between two, you know, the origination, the host nation. So both the Jewish diaspora and the diaspora that is central to critical race studies, which is the African diaspora, diverge from this model. So I think for that reason alone, it is more interesting for someone who's looking at connections between communities beyond national borders. But then there are very different understandings of diaspora, of course, and one that I think goes very well with my understanding of queer of color critique, which is also kind of embracing a positionality that doesn't really build on being representative or being authentic, but questions those notions. And that is an understanding of diaspora that has been developed a lot by theorists of Caribbean descent, such as Stuart Hall is of course very, very important there, but also Evaldsson, who tried to capture the positionality of an African descended Caribbean population that kind of falls between frameworks that are often important in the approach that is maybe more dominant here where I am right now in the US than in Europe. The idea of settler colonial nations vis-a-vis indigenous populations and the relationship to the land. So the land is something that to be exploited and used. It was foundational, of course, to colonialism, and different relationships to the land were disvalued exactly because of that. So in the kind of colonial mindset, the very fact that native or nativized populations did not aim to conquer the land was a reason to take it away from them. So a lot of important strategies of resistance build on that, but then as Evaldsson pointed out, there is no claim to the land that the descendants of enslaved Africans have. So how can you think about relationship in ways that have less to do with roots and more with relations? So my concept of diaspora is very much indebted to that, thinking about communities that are that don't really share an origin or a racial identification, but share a particular positionality that comes out of this system of global racial capitalism, but that doesn't necessarily focus on shared roots, but is in some ways conditional. So it's a kind of community that can be very strong, but can also be temporary. It can fall apart because there's not this stable identity that is behind it. And that's also a little different from many understandings of the African diaspora. But the challenges of those more clear-cut understandings of diaspora, I think, become obvious if we look at populations that are included, for example, in the notion of African diaspora, but that are marginal. So that is true for Afro-Caribbean populations, of Black populations in Latin America, and it's, I think, definitely also true of Afro-Europeans, starting with the question, what is the relationship between Blackness and Africanness? Being myself a Black person of North African descent, I'm faced with this idea that North Africa is the quote-unquote white part of Africa. So how does that play into notions of how we understand Africa, how we understand Blackness? Or to come back to the example of Roma, what does it mean that Roma are considered Black in some parts of Eastern Europe, which doesn't mean that they're considered to be of African descent, but they are considered Black, and that kind of puts the focus back to those who create racial labels rather than to those that are assigned those labels. So what I'm thinking about is how you can see intersections and interactions between, for example, African, Roma, Muslim diasporas, but you also can see them as one diaspora. So that is a concept that, for me, usefully allows me to move, kind of below the nation, to look at translocal connections, but also beyond the nation, but also to look within the nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you something about that, lifting the gaze, so beyond the national. Why is that so important in your work? Because you look into national settings to highlight larger European tendencies, and why is it necessary to lift this gaze?
I think because there are simply certain structures that are not coincidentally Europe-wide. So I think it's important to look at this idea of Europe, because Europe is an idea, right? It's a construct, and it's very powerful, and it becomes more and more powerful in this supposedly post-national phase that we are in. So in some ways, it makes sense to look at the national, but then if you see particular patterns, say every single nation has their own story why their particular form of colonialism was different and better because, because it was only very short. In the German example, the Dutch have a tendency to believe that their kind of colonialism was particularly benevolent. So if there is a variation of the same story all across Europe, why is that? What does it feed into? And I think it just feeds into Europe as a key concept, also in the certainly in the later colonial period, as a way to construct a unity out of European nations. Whiteness is an overarching concept. The naturalization of Europe as whiteness as an overarching concept that doesn't work just on the national level. And of course, a lot of things that Europe distanced itself from, such as racism, are projected onto a supposedly divided national past, right? The past where Europe was not united. But what happens, in fact, is that these same structures are repeated in the European context, and the end of the Cold War and this reconstruction of Europe was a very, very important point where European history needed to be rewritten, right? Because you had these two diverging narratives in the East and West, and now they needed to be combined, and they were combined largely as the ultimate European capitalist success story, which in many ways kind of externalizes a lot of Eastern European history as not really European. But what it also does, of course, is to completely leave out the colonial past. So this is a rewriting of history that is built on a European consensus. This has to be a story that has its national variations, but it has to be compatible with the larger story. So that also means that colonialism is something that is external to Europe, is part of this larger narrative that plays out in every nation. And that also means that there's no real interrogation of the long-term effects of the colonial past in any of those nations. And I do think that this idea of Europe and its material and political implications are much more powerful and relevant now than any notions of Germanness, Frenchness, whatever.
Yeah, so this would be also the notion of national memory, as you write in your book, European Others. So the narrative of a shared European memory that has to be constituted in a particular way. Is that maybe can you reflect a bit more on that notion of this memory, the national memory, and whether or not this is tied to particular nation states or European wide?
Well, I think it has to be European wide, and where it's not, there's always conflict. And the goal in some ways is to control that conflict. And you have that more obviously with particular national histories that sort of reject that larger European narrative. But you also have that within each nation with stories that don't fit that narrative, and national memory has a lot to do, of course, it's probably most to do with the national present, but it also has a lot to do with the national future, right? Because the power of this kind of official national memory that gets that basically is reproduced everywhere, but a major part is schools. So this is something that you as a national citizen are asked to internalize. So that also shapes what a nation defines as its possible future. If we talk about multiculturalism, and you have a discourse where this is something completely new and threatening, and it will take enormous energy to make it happen, then that limits the possibilities, right? But this perspective is based on a notion of a past that was very different from this supposedly multicultural present, right? But there are different narratives of the past that you could create. But part of this this national memory that then is tied to the European memory is that there can only be one story. So then that means that certain collective memories are excluded. And to come back to one of the most obvious examples, again, it's the presence of colonialism. So if you have one narrative that is based on the experience of those that are the descendants of the colonizers, then the memory of those who are the descendants of the colonized can have an equal space, because those are not stories that go together. So if one is defined as the European story, then the other story is not part of Europe. And then that is tied to the notion that those people, those descendants of the formerly colonized, are also not really part of Europe. So it also always creates a sense of ownership. If you own a national history, you own the nation, you are the one who can decide who belongs and who doesn't belong. And then the question is, would it be possible to have a national memory or a European memory that includes the histories and the memories of those that have been colonizers and those that have been colonized, for example. And I think this is something that we would have to get to, but that can't happen with the understanding of both national and continental histories that we have now.
Yeah, and one way you describe in your work that this narrative can be countered is the role that the arts and activism can play, right, in creating a counter memory discourse. How could that function? And how is that already functioning?
Well, I think it's functioning in the sense that a collective identity needs a vision of the future, but it also needs an understanding of the past. So there are always counter histories, always counter memories, but they often are not expressed in the traditional venues because they have no place there. And they come up in other spaces that might not seem like those. One of them would be graffiti, for example. You have one thing I looked at a little bit at some point was graffiti against police violence in various parts of Europe at different times. And I initially saw that as a material manifestation of resistance, right, of creating a public, of saying, well, this happened, right? It's been denied, it's not talked about, but it happened in here in the public because we have no other space, we create a statement. But then I realized that it's also a way of creating a counter memory, right? Because it creates an archive of an experience that is shared by racialized populations across Europe. So that was graffiti that I looked at that particularly addressed police violence against Black communities. So you have very little tracing of that violence in public records or even in the records of activists against police violence who don't think race is a relevant factor, but you have this archive all across Europe through graffiti. So that would be one example of using art/activism as not only an intervention into the present, but also as a way to create a story of a shared past. And another strategy is to disrupt this this dominant narrative by bringing in different stories. And again, there are many examples of people, groups doing that, both through art and activism. One example that I looked at in my last book was right around the time, right in '89, before the Berlin Wall came down, before the Soviet Union officially dissolved. You had, you know, compared to now, a tiny number of Roma refugees in Germany, who were all facing deportation, with a rhetoric around it that, you know, that was just too much, we can't take it. And of course, there's a history of genocide against Roma and Sinti in Germany. So what a group of Roma activists tried to do was to activate that memory by occupying a former concentration camp close to Hamburg, to basically intervene in this larger German memory discourse of, we, you know, what is special about our genocide is that we actually admit to it, and that we have processed this history, that we have admitted guilt. And I'm not saying that this whole process is fake, and in some ways it's important, but it's very, very limited, because what it still insists in is that the perpetrators have the right to define the story. They are generous and self-reflective enough to tell a story that doesn't completely whitewash them, but it's still they who control the story. And that was very obvious in this example of the Roma activists, who completely failed with their attempt to kind of say, remember what you did to us, and now you're deporting us in a situation where lives are threatened. Don't you think you have a certain responsibility? And the German answer was pretty much no. We're busy with something totally different, and you are, as usual, a nuisance. So that is important in the sense that it shows that this universal narrative, this one story, even if it seems pretty liberal, open, will immediately shut you down if you really challenge it. So it has an inherent violence that can often remain under the surface, but when necessary, it comes out immediately. So those are kind of two very different examples of how these counter histories work, but there are of course many, many others.
Yeah. Maybe as a last question from my side already, because time flies, and then I will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So my last question would be, what, according to you, could be a way forward to come back to these two fields of race and migration studies? What, in the ideal case, in your view, would be the future?
Well, I mean, that's a really, really tricky question. I feel like that we kind of now in a sort of dystopian state that is different insofar as it doesn't respect these lines that are still often there. So I think there's obviously, on some level, we all know that the world as it is doesn't work, but there's still this illusion that it really, really doesn't work for a lot of people, but it still works for some. And those some are mostly in the West. And I think it becomes very obvious that that's not the case. It doesn't work for anyone and nobody is safe. But the first reaction, of course, is not to say, you know, we did wrong, let's do it differently, but to be even stronger in trying to shut yourself off from the from the consequences of that, which, you know, is obvious in the rise of the extreme right and of white nationalism or other kinds of ethnic nationalism. And I do think that both migration studies and critical race studies have important tools to challenge that. But especially migration studies, because it's more integrated into the European institutional landscape, also faces a lot of constraints. So I don't know, I on the one hand understand and to a certain extent share this frustration with theorizing and with academia that doesn't seem to really address a lot of the most pressing problems. At the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that there wouldn't be concerted attacks on academia, and especially on fields like here in the US, critical race studies, gender studies, migration studies in Europe, if there wasn't something that those fields could do to challenge the existing system. So I think that kind of looking at the larger picture, what has to happen is not reform, but a complete restructuring of the way things are. And again, it would be great if there was one answer, one approach. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that there can be a coalition. I think what would be great would be a way to be able to kind of resolve this conflict between those within migration studies who are sure that race is not a useful concept in the understanding of Europe, and those who do. But I'm not sure if that's possible, but maybe that just means that people have to make a choice. But yeah, that's always the tricky question. Where can we go? I as somebody who's was trained as an historian and then never wanted to certainly work in a department of history, I still think that that it's important to look to the past and to remember that there was never one story and one approach that dominated. There was always attention, and there was always a lot of energy invested in silencing and repressing all these alternatives. And I think we can turn to that to gain some energy and have some ideas. And for going forward, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, I'm living here directly at the US-Mexican border. There's one of the biggest migrant detention centers here that is privately owned. So, you know, it's not even primarily about deporting people as soon as possible. It's about detaining them, making as much money off them as possible, and then deporting them. And it already seems really challenging to try to shut down this one center. But on the other hand, of course, if people manage to have these seemingly small victories somewhere, that will have a ripple effect on people everywhere. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, the future is always hard to predict. I have a very good question here from Bernard Toprak. How would you reflect on the entanglement of race and religion in Europe's Muslim question? And what role does the practice of racial amnesia play in this particular question?
Well, I think one of the problems with Europe being like absurdly marginal really in theorizations of race is that there is not this kind of systematic attention to the context out of which the racial concept developed in Europe, and a much more common understanding of what race does and has done is more applicable to settler colonial contexts, where racial slavery is more obviously of importance, where the genocide, displacement of native populations is of more obvious importance, whereas in Europe, the racialization of religion was something that was always, I would say, central to understandings of race. So that doesn't mean that this understanding of race and the practice of racism in, for example, Europe and the US is completely different, but certain elements are central or not. The role of religion was relatively marginal in the US for a long time, but of course the fact that it could be activated so easily, in particular after 9/11, shows that it was already there. It was just not very central. So in a similar way, racial slavery was important to Europe, but what was always more central was this conflation of whiteness and Christianity that was a means to define Europe and a means to, of course, justify conquest. And so in that sense, I would mostly say from that perspective, if we look at Muslims in Europe right now, a major reason that they are at the center is that they are the most relevant non-Christian European religion right now, and that there are a lot of European Muslims. So this kind of othering is always important if it's really part of what you define of your own. If the other is far away, then you don't have to worry too much. But if the other threatens to become you, then you have to push back. And I do think this is what is happening with Muslims in Europe. And then in particular, the particular ways and that plays out has a lot to do with class, with the fact that many European Muslims are descendants of labor migrants. So that puts them in a particular position that in some ways is similar to the Latinx population here in the US, but in the discourse around that population, religion doesn't really play a huge role right now. And in terms of racial amnesia, that goes both with regard to the obvious connection to the other relevant non-Christian European religious minority, namely Jews, looking at not so much equations, but asking what did those two populations do to the notion of Europeanness that produced the necessity to define them as other. And the other amnesia would be the important role that Islam always played to Europe, or to Europe as soon as Europe started to define itself as such. You can say before Europe started to colonize, Europe was colonized. Part of Europe was colonized by a Muslim empire. So there's a history of entanglement that is very much rewritten as a history of separation and conflict, rather than a history of that included a lot of intersections and overlaps that have to be produced as separate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for for these very intriguing further questions as well. Just to allow some space for other questions, I combined several ones. So there is a question about what role does class play in queer of color critique, and earlier on, so the question reads, you stated that class is seen as a universal category and race is not, and could you elaborate on that, and which scholarship do you refer to?
Well, class, speaking about queer of color critique, class plays an important role in part because of this grounding in intersectionality, which had its foundation in this relationship between race, class, and gender. Queer of color critique builds on that in part in response to queer as a term, or as a political term, and as a term of identification really gained ground in the 90s as a kind of response to a more assimilationist identity politics, which now plays out with one of the most celebrated moves that Biden made, being in office very, very briefly only, is that he reversed the ban on transgender soldiers in the US Army, which of course gets rid of a very blatant form of discrimination, but it doesn't question the use of the US Army, especially in terms of class, as a space that contains a huge population that can't really find any space in the labor market. Of course, the other huge population would be the ones in prisons. So what has happened in part with the integration of queer theory into academia is that this understanding that kind of says queer doesn't mean sexual identity, and otherwise we're like you, queer means that we question the system as it is. But that understanding of queerness, of course, as you know, one of the differences between, as people like Jody Melamed point out, or Grace Hong, the difference between an earlier system of white supremacy that was expressed in racial segregation in the US and colonialism in Europe was, they were just laws. If you were not white, you couldn't do that. End of story. The system that we have now is very different. This neoliberal system that works with a kind of fake inclusion also is able to, rather than suppress, to assimilate a lot of ideas, such as queer, such as multicultural, such as intersectional. So queer of color critique is an attempt to counter that, and to come back to an understanding of queerness that has to do with positionality. So with a certain marginalization that can be turned into a threat to the system. And this is a positionality that you don't automatically have just because you're lesbian or gay or whatever. It is something that is tied to understandings of class, for example, in the sense that there are factually growing disparities, but then you have a kind of inclusion of people that tries to erase the fact that the structures to which this inclusion works are based on older systems of, to give you another name, Cedric Robinson, who was key in developing this idea of global racial capitalism, which is not uncontested, but which I think is a good one in understanding that it's not only about race, but it's also not only about class, it's about the intersections of the two that broadly create a system where people have different value. And we have all internalized that to such an extent that it is possible, even though I understand that a lot of people are generally upset about that, that thousands of people die on the borders of Europe all the time, because we know that their life is not as valuable as our life as people living in the West, which also means that it's not only about white people in the West. The most, I think, interesting forms of resistance, such as a group in France called les Indigènes de la République, both challenges this this unquestioned equation of whiteness and Europeanness, but also says whiteness is a position of privilege that also has a lot to do with class. So that in one context within Europe, all my class privilege doesn't help me because I'm not white, and that can have very harsh consequences. That is true. But at the same time, my positionality as a European, albeit a non-white European, also gives me a lot of class privileges that I don't lose. So queer color critique for me is a way to deal with that tension. And it does mean that both class and race are treated as a universal that plays out in particulars. I think that's the best that I can put it. It's not that either one or the other in every context anywhere in the world is not relevant, but how they exactly interact with each other and with other categories is something that we always need to look at closer, but we can only do that if we have a lens that gives equal importance to all those categories. And just generally speaking, I don't know, there a lot of important continental European Marxist thinkers, but I can't really think of any of them who does that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for your answers, both to my questions and some of the audience. I'm sorry that we already came to the end of this this lecture. I just want to thank you very much for joining us today, and the audience for sending so many questions that unfortunately we could not all address, but I invite you all to join us also for the next session, which takes place on the 17th of February and which will center around the institutional aspects of studying race and migration in Europe with Amada Matarek and Tobias Ubinet. So thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, and really thank you all the people that are there who I unfortunately can't see, but thank you so much for your questions.